Venezuela is sitting on the oil reserves.
President Trump is focused on Venezuela's oil.
Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than the United States. On paper, Venezuela should be one of the richest countries in the world. Instead, millions of Venezuelans have left the country. At the height of the crisis, inflation became so severe that ordinary people struggled to keep up with the rapidly changing prices. Basic goods became difficult to find. Economic activity collapsed. How does a country sitting on so much wealth end up facing hardship? And Venezuela isn't alone. The Democratic Republic of Congo sits atop some of the world's most valuable mineral deposits. Nigeria has been one of Africa's largest oil exporters for decades. Yet all three countries have struggled to transform natural wealth into widespread prosperity. Ask yourself this question: how is that possible? Most people assume resources create wealth. History suggests something more complicated, because throughout history, extraordinary natural wealth has often produced extraordinary problems. Conflict, corruption, dependency, political instability, and economic stagnation. Economists have a name for this pattern. They call it the resource curse. And understanding why it happens may be one of the most important economic questions of our time. Because this isn't really about only resources. It's a story about ownership, institutions, governance, and the systems that determine where that value ultimately flows. The resource curse is one of the strangest ideas in economics. The basic concept is simple. Countries blessed with large amounts of oil, minerals, or other natural resources often perform worse than countries with fewer resources. At first glance, that sounds impossible. More resources should mean more wealth. More wealth should mean more prosperity. But reality repeatedly tells a different story. For every Norway, there is a Venezuela. For every Botswana, there's a Congo. For every success story, there are multiple examples of countries that struggle despite possessing extraordinary natural wealth. And when you study these countries closely, the resource itself is rarely the deciding factor. The real question is what happens after the resource is discovered. Who owns it? Who controls it? Who benefits from it? And what institutions exist to manage it? Those questions determine far more than the resource itself, because resources don't create prosperity automatically. People do, institutions do, and systems do as well. One of the mechanisms behind the resource curse is something called the Dutch disease. The term comes from the Netherlands. After discovering large natural gas reserves in the 1960s, the Dutch economy experienced an unexpected problem. Resource revenues flooded into the country. The national currency strengthened. At first, that sounded like good news, but a stronger currency made Dutch exports more expensive. Manufacturing became less competitive. Other industries began to struggle. Over time, more and more economic activity became concentrated around a single sector, the resource sector. The economy became less diversified and less resilient. This pattern has repeated itself around the world. When countries become dependent on one commodity, they become vulnerable to the forces they cannot control. Commodity prices rise. Everything looks great. Commodity prices fall. The entire economy suffers. The very thing that created the prosperity becomes the source of instability. And that's exactly what happened in several resource-rich countries. Few countries illustrate this more dramatically than Venezuela. For decades, oil generated wealth. At one point, oil accounted for the overwhelming majority of Venezuela's export earnings. The country's economy became heavily dependent on the single commodity. As long as the oil prices remained high, that dependence seemed manageable. When prices collapsed, the weakness became impossible to ignore. Now it's important to acknowledge something very important. Venezuela's crisis wasn't caused by one single factor. Economic mismanagement played a role, political instability played a role, corruption played a role, and also their dependence on oil played a role. International politics and also geopolitical pressures as well. The reality is far more complicated than political narratives on both sides of the coin pretended to be. But regardless of where someone falls politically, one lesson remains difficult to ignore. Building an economy around a single resource creates enormous vulnerability. When that resource experiences a shock, the entire system feels it, and millions of ordinary people pay the price. Nigeria presents a very different story. Nigeria is one of Africa's largest oil producers. For decades, oil has generated billions of dollars in revenue, yet millions of Nigerians continue to live in poverty. The Niger Delta, where much of the oil is extracted, remains one of the most environmentally damaged regions on the continent. Communities sit above immense wealth while often lacking reliable infrastructure and economic opportunity. The problem isn't that Nigeria lacks resources. The problem is that resource wealth alone cannot guarantee development. Resources create opportunity, but they do not automatically create prosperity. That requires institutions capable of managing opportunities effectively. And that's exactly where many resource-rich countries struggle. Because extracting wealth and distributing wealth are two different things. I've spoken previously about my time in the Congo, or should I say the Democratic Republic of Congo. But this time I want to talk about something a little differently. Not ownership, but governance. One thing that struck me wasn't simply the country's resource wealth, it was the contrast. In Kinshasa, you can see signs of economic activity everywhere. There's construction projects, entrepreneurs trying to build business, and people just working hard to improve their lives. At the same time, many public services remain inconsistent. Infrastructure gaps remain visible. In fact, it can take you 2 hours to drive from the city center to Njili Airport, which is less than 20 miles away. Basic government functions that many people take for granted can be unreliable. And that's what makes the resource curse so fascinating. The question is whether it has institutions capable of transforming resource wealth into long-term development. A copper deposit doesn't create independent judiciary. Gold reserves don't automatically create reliable public infrastructure. Those outcomes depend on governance. They depend on decisions. They depend on institutions. The more I study countries struggling with the resource curse, the more I realize something. Resources are often the easy part. Building effective institutions is the hard part. And that may be one of the most important lessons that we're going to learn. Political scientists have another concept that helps them explain why governance becomes so difficult. It's called a Rentier State. In most countries, governments rely heavily on taxes. The citizens pay taxes, citizens demand accountability, and they ask questions. How is our money being spent? Why aren't services providing? Why aren't services improving? Why are institutions functioning? Taxation creates pressure, and pressure creates accountability. But instead of relying primarily on citizens for revenue, they rely on resource income, oil royalties, mining concessions, export revenues. The government can fund itself without depending heavily on taxpayers. And when governments become less dependent on citizens, accountability can weaken. Not always, but often enough that some scholars have repeatedly seen this pattern. The incentive structure changes, and incentives do matter quite a bit. The resource curse is not inevitable. Botswana proves that. Following independence, Botswana discovered significant diamond deposits. Unlike many resource-rich countries, Botswana invested heavily in governance, education, infrastructure, and long-term planning. The result was one of Africa's most remarkable development stories. Norway followed a similar path. When Norway discovered North Sea oil, it already possessed strong institutions, low corruption, independent courts, and democratic accountability. Norway also created a sovereign wealth fund designed to invest oil revenues for future generations. Instead of consuming all of its resource wealth immediately, it converted temporary resources into long-term wealth. Today, that fund is one of the largest in the world. The lesson is powerful. The resource itself determines very little. Institutions determine almost everything. 4 videos into this series, a pattern keeps appearing. The names change, the countries change, the circumstances change, but the lessons remain remarkably the same. Greenwood built economic systems. The Bank of Italy built financial institutions, and China built industrial systems. Norway built governance institutions. Meanwhile, countries like Venezuela, Nigeria, and the Congo remind us that resources are not enough alone. The resource curse is not really about resources. It never was. It's about what happens after resources are discovered. Ownership matters. Institutions matter. Governance matters. Resources create opportunity. Ownership determines who captures the value. Governance determines what happens to that value afterward. And the countries that succeed are often not the countries with the most natural wealth. They're the countries with the strongest systems for managing it, because prosperity isn't ultimately created by what lies beneath the ground. It's created by the institutions built above. Perspective matters. Ownership matters. Institutions matters. And like most things in life, everything is about trade-offs. Until next time.